every December, while a great many people are slowing down, spending a little more, thinking a little less, and promising themselves that the serious work will begin in January. I find myself becoming more alert. That may sound backward. Most of the world treats the final weeks of the year as a landing strip. I have always treated them as a launch pad. I am not saying a person should never rest. Rest matters, reflection matters, family matters. A good meal with people you love matters. But from a financial point of view, these last weeks of the year carry a kind of quiet power that very few people use properly. The reason is simple. A year ending gives you something the middle of the year almost never gives you cleanly. It gives you contrast. It gives you a closed stretch of behavior you can examine honestly. It gives you numbers that have already happened, decisions that cannot be disguised as intentions anymore, and patterns that are much harder to romanticize because 12 months have now testified against your story. That is very useful. I have spent a great deal of my life around money, but I have spent even more time around human behavior with money. And one thing I have learned is that people almost never fail financially because they fail because they prefer their hopes to their records. Hope sounds better. Records are better. A great many people say they want to build wealth. Much fewer can tell you calmly and specifically what their money actually did for the last 12 months. They know what they intended. They know what kind of person they imagine themselves to be. They know the noble story, but they do not know the path their dollars really took. That is where a proper money reset begins. Not with motivation, with truth. If I were speaking to a younger version of myself, or to any ordinary household trying to make next year meaningfully stronger than the last one, I would not begin with the stock market. I would not begin with interest rates. I would not begin with a list of hot accounts, side hustles, or productivity tricks. I would begin end reckoning, a money wrapped, if you want a modern phrase for it. The phrase itself does not matter. The idea matters. At the end of the year, I want to know three things: what actually came in, what actually went out, and what, after all the noise, was truly left. Not what I hoped I saved, not what I told myself I was basically doing. What happened? That distinction is enormous. You would be astonished how many intelligent, hard-working adults move through life with only a ceremonial relationship to these numbers. They are not ignorant in some broad sense. They can do their jobs. They can navigate airports. They can operate machinery, negotiate deals, raise children, and discuss politics with confidence. Yet ask them what their actual after-tax income was over the year, what their real all-in spending was, and whether they ended in surplus or deficit after including savings and investments honestly. And they begin speaking a dialect made mostly of impressions. Impressions do not build wealth, arithmetic does. So the first thing I would do every December is sit down with the records and ask for honesty in the simplest possible form. What was my net income for the year? Not gross, not the flattering number. What truly arrived after taxes, salary, bonus, rental income, side work? Dividends received in cash, if that matters in the household system. Any money that genuinely came in. Then I would ask the next question: what was my real annual spending? And I want this done in a way that strips away self-deception. Housing, food, transportation, insurance, utilities, children, travel, subscriptions, dining out, shopping, everything. But then I would do something that some people find strange the first time they hear it. I would include savings and investments as part of spending for this annual review. Not because savings and investments are the same thing as consumption. They are not. They are far superior. But when I am trying to understand the leftover capacity in a life, I want to know how much money was actually assigned to any destination, whether that destination was rent, groceries, an index fund, or a contribution to a retirement account. If I separate saving from spending at this stage, I can accidentally flatter myself by calling money surplus that has already been spoken for. I want to know what remained after everything, including the good uses of money, was accounted for. Only then do I know whether there was true surplus. Only then do I know whether there was untapped capacity. And only then do I know whether the story I told myself all year was true. This is one reason I dislike vague money talk. People say things like, I think I did pretty well this year, or I definitely saved more, or I did not spend that much except on a few trips. That kind of language is soft where money must be hard. What actually happened? That is the question. A great many illusions lose their power. You begin seeing whether winter was expensive because you were bored and purchased comfort. You begin seeing whether summer destroyed your discipline through weddings, travel, and what I like to call the social tax, the cost of trying to prove you are alive in the same places and in the same way as everybody else around you. You begin seeing whether your raises became investments or just nicer ways to stay fragile. That is why this first exercise matters so much. It is not bookkeeping for its own sake. It is pattern recognition. And in personal finance, pattern recognition is often worth more than one good investing idea. Now, after you have looked honestly at the year, you are ready for the second step, the yearly audit. This is where you go hunting for silent leaks. The financial world loves grand theories because they sound intelligent. Inflation, monetary policy, housing cycles, artificial intelligence, recession probabilities. Fine, these things matter. But an astonishing amount of personal weakness still comes from something much more ordinary. Money leaving without purpose. Subscriptions, old apps, software no one uses. Streaming services attached to one series you watched in March and never touched again. Memberships that now function mainly as evidence of intention. A gym payment for a person who has not seen the inside of the building in months. A tool that solved one old problem and now solves none. People think these are tiny issues. They are not tiny when multiplied by years and combined with every other leak no one respects enough to stop. But the real savings often sit one layer deeper: phone plans, internet, insurance, all the recurring adult expenses that quietly rise because the provider knows most people do not review them. Companies bet on laziness the way casinos bet on impulse. They understand human behavior better than the customer does. So every December I would pull these bills into the light. Not because I enjoy paperwork, I do not. Because paying more than necessary for things that must exist anyway is one of the dullest and easiest forms of self-sabotage in modern life. The market will make life complicated enough on its own. You do not need to help it by overpaying for your own plumbing. Insurance is one of the great offenders here because it is emotionally invisible right up until you need it. That invisibility makes people lazy. They accept annual increases because the product itself is not experienced daily. Phone plans are similar. Broadband software, anything recurring. Every one of these deserves a yearly challenge. Am I using this? Do I need this? Can I get the same utility at a lower cost? That is not deprivation, that is maintenance. And maintenance is one of the most underrated financial virtues in the world. Now let us go deeper, because this is where people often make a more sophisticated mistake. They trim the leaks and then congratulate themselves too early. That is not enough. Once the leaks are reduced, you have to rebuild the foundation. Every strong financial life rests on one simple idea that people say they understand and then ignore for years. If you do not have a cash buffer, almost every other smart decision you make remains vulnerable to one stupid interruption. That is why I care so much about emergency reserves. I know this subject does not excite people. Good excitement is not the standard. Function is the emergency reserve is not there to beat the market. It is there to keep you from insulting the market by being forced to sell at the wrong time. It is not there to make you feel rich. It is there to keep an ordinary setback from turning into a structural injury. And people misunderstand this constantly because they think an emergency fund once built is finished forever. That is not how life works. If your rent rose, if your mortgage changed, if you added children, if you now carry new insurance obligations, if transportation costs rose, if your life became more expensive in any durable way, then an emergency reserve built years ago may no longer be an emergency reserve in the sense that matters. It may now be a gesture. You must ask a hard question. If my income stopped tomorrow, for how long could I actually maintain the core structure of my life without becoming panicked or stupid? Not the aspirational version of life. The real one, if the answer is not 3 to 6 months, and sometimes more depending on your work and obligations, then your foundation needs rebuilding. Now, people often make the opposite mistake too. They become afraid of every possible event and allow too much money to sit in cash forever. That is also an error. Anything above a sensible emergency reserve that is not needed in the next several years should be thought about differently. Cash is excellent for stability. It is poor for long-term compounding. Inflation does not look dramatic in 1 month, given enough years. It behaves like termites. That is why a year-end money reset must include a second balance question. How much of what I am holding in cash is actually protection, and how much is just undeployed capital slowly becoming less useful? That line matters. People often think they are being prudent when they are actually just being hesitant. So the third task in the year-end reset is to look at the cash investment balance honestly. Do I have enough liquidity to remain calm? Do I have too much cash to remain intelligent? That is the real question, because the goal is never to sit on the most cash. The goal is to keep enough cash that life cannot bully you into ruining your investments while still putting long-term money into productive assets where time can work. That is architecture. And architecture always beats enthusiasm. Now let me move to something people ignore even more than emergency reserves. Free money. There are very few places in life where a person can get a genuine edge with almost no uncertainty. Employer matching in retirement accounts is one of them, yet millions of people fail to use it. That is like declining a raise and then saying you are serious about building wealth. I do not understand it, except in the sense that I understand people are busy, distracted, intimidated by paperwork, or operating under the false impression that they will really get into all that later. Later is where a lot of free money goes to die. If your employer matches contributions and you are not contributing enough to collect the full match, you are not merely missing an opportunity. You are actively volunteering for a smaller financial future than the one available to you. That is unacceptable if the problem is only neglect. The same is true with tax-advantaged allowances. Every country has its own rules, but the principle is universal. Governments, for their own reasons, provide windows in which certain kinds of saving, investing, and giving are treated more favorably than ordinary cash flow. These windows do not stay open forever. Use it or lose it is not a slogan. It is an operating law. A person who understands this does not drift into year-end. He checks which allowances reset. He checks which contributions can still be made. He checks whether charitable giving can be structured intelligently. He checks whether losses or gains should be harvested thoughtfully inside the rules available to him. Not because he is trying to outsmart the tax code in some theatrical way, because a serious person does not leave structural advantages unused out of laziness. I have always liked systems where the rules, clearly understood, can be used honestly to your advantage. That is what rational capital allocation is. You take the world as it is and operate well inside it. Complaining does not beat structure. That is why I would tell anyone doing a year-end money reset to learn the calendar of their own system. What date matters? What resets? what can still be done before then. This is not glamorous work. It is highly profitable over a lifetime. Now, once the leaks are reduced, the foundation is rebuilt, and the overlooked advantages are claimed, you have earned the right to do something many people do in the wrong order. Set next year's goals. I am suspicious of vague financial goals. Save more. Do better. Be more organized. Those are wishes, not plans. A plan has numbers. A plan has dates. A plan has arithmetic severe enough that it can disagree with your mood. If a person says, I want to save $6,000 by next December, I know something. If he says, I want to be better with money, I know nothing. A year-end reset is the proper moment to decide what the next 12 months are supposed to do for you, not what would feel nice, what the money should accomplish. Emergency reserve to a certain level, credit card gone, retirement contribution raised by a certain percentage, brokerage account funded at a certain monthly rate, down payment fund built to a certain threshold, business runway expanded, travel fully funded without borrowing. These are goals, numbers, dates, direction. Without direction, money leaks toward appetite. This is one of the oldest truths in finance. Money without assignment gets spent by whatever desire happens to be loudest in the moment. That is why budgeting, when done well, is not a prison. It is pre-decision. You are telling the future version of yourself what matters before the environment begins its negotiations. Now, once you have those goals, I want to move to the final stage, because this is where most people fail even after doing the hard reflective work. They build a beautiful plan that depends entirely on feeling like the kind of person who follows beautiful plans. I do not trust willpower very much. Willpower is useful in short bursts. Systems are better. A proper money reset must end with an operating system. Automation, friction reduction, visibility. That is how things stick. If your financial future depends on remembering every month to save what is left over, there will not be much left over. Saving should happen before your emotions get a vote. Investing should happen before spending gets a chance to behave like entitlement. Bill payments should not rely on memory. Sinking funds for predictable, irregular expenses should not appear by magic. All of this can be systematized. And once systematized, it stops stealing so much mental bandwidth. That is the real gift. The goal is not to think about money all day. The goal is to build a structure in which money does its quiet work while you live a more useful life. That means automatic transfers to savings, automatic contributions to investments, automatic retirement contributions, scheduled bill payments, separate buckets for irregular but inevitable expenses like car maintenance, insurance renewals, holidays, birthdays, school costs, or annual memberships. The irregular becomes much less dangerous once it is treated as inevitable in advance rather than surprising in the moment. That is another thing I wish more people understood. Most emergencies are not emergencies. They are neglected certainties. The car will need work. Insurance will renew. A holiday season will arrive. Gifts will need buying. A relative will get married. The child will outgrow the thing, if it happens every year or every few years. It is not a surprise. It is a pattern asking for a bucket. Once you start seeing life that way, your money system becomes much less dramatic. It becomes a map instead of a series of rescues. And the less rescue work your financial life requires, the more energy you have for the parts of life that actually deserve your spirit. Now let me say something that may be even more important than any tool or account or automation. All of this only works if you stop trying to use your money to prove something. So many households are financially weak, not because the income is too low, but because the spending has been recruited into the service of identity. The house must say something, the car must say something, the holidays must say something, the gifts must say something, the clothes, the restaurants, the schools, the subscriptions, the social performances, the constant little transactions all begin saying one thing. That is a terrible burden to put on money. Money should make life quieter, not louder. A strong financial operating system is almost always a quieter one. Fewer leaks, fewer surprise bills, fewer dramatic swings, more automation, more intention, more margin. I care about margin more than almost any other concept in household finance. Margin is room. Room to make a mistake. Room to wait. Room to absorb a shock. Room to say no. A person with no margin is never fully calm, no matter what his gross salary says. A person with margin may not look rich at all and still live a financially superior life, because his structure gives him something the more visibly successful person does not have. Breathing room. That is what a good December money reset creates, not merely a cleaner spreadsheet, a cleaner year ahead. Now, if you want the sequence in the plainest possible terms, here it is. First, study the past year honestly, then remove the silent leaks, then rebuild your cash foundation, then claim every structural advantage available, including matches and tax allowances. Then decide what next year is for in numbers, not wishes. Then automate the decisions so that your future is not being renegotiated every payday. That is how a person turns a page on the calendar without merely repeating himself in a slightly different outfit. I have seen many people say they want a new financial year. What they often mean is that they want the same habits to produce a different result. That is not a plan. A proper reset changes the path, not just the slogan. And here is the best part. None of this requires genius. It does not require picking brilliant stocks. It does not require predicting interest rates. It does not require some grand revelation about the next economic cycle. It requires honesty, arithmetic, and a willingness to do a few boring things with more consistency than the average person. I have always thought there was an enormous amount of money available to people willing to be slightly more organized than the crowd and slightly less performative than the culture demands. That is what this whole exercise really is. A refusal to drift. A refusal to leave your future governed by forgotten subscriptions, lazy tax habits, unmeasured spending, no reserve, vague goals, and a total dependence on mood. I do not want your money to depend on your mood. I want it to depend on design. Design is sturdier. Design survives bad weeks. Design survives travel, stress, family obligations, and whatever else life throws at a person. And once the design is strong, next year stops feeling like a hope and starts feeling like a structure. That is how good financial years are made. Not at midnight on New Year's Eve, in a quiet room before the year ends, with the numbers in front of you. The truth admitted clearly enough that the future finally has a chance to become different from the past. There is another advantage to doing this work in December that most people miss. The calendar itself. Human beings are highly symbolic creatures, whether they admit it or not. We care about Monday in a way Thursday does not receive. We care about birthdays, anniversaries, and fresh years because the mind likes boundaries. It likes chapters. It likes a sense that one era can close and another can begin with some measure of intention. That tendency can be childish if you use it only for slogans. It can be incredibly powerful if you use it for systems. The end of the year is one of the very few moments when even undisciplined people are temporarily willing to look at their life as a whole. They are willing to review, willing to ask whether this year looked like the person they meant to become, willing to admit, for a brief window, that the current approach may not be producing the current result they wanted. That window matters. Most of the year, we are too busy living inside the machinery of our routines to question them properly. December cracks the routine open a little. You should use that crack. You should not waste it on vague declarations about being better, saving more, or taking money seriously. You should use it to build one system that will still be operating in March when your enthusiasm is gone, and the weather is ugly and nobody is posting optimistic goals online anymore. That is what separates people who improve from people who perform improvement. A performer of improvement loves the ritual of planning. The improver loves the architecture of execution. He asks practical questions. What account should receive the emergency fund transfer automatically? On what day? What percentage of each paycheck should go to investment before I see it? What spending categories need limits? What recurring charges need to be challenged or canceled? What exact amount should be redirected to the retirement plan? How will I see progress at a glance without needing to build a shrine to complexity? Those are useful questions. Useful questions produce useful years. There is one more error I want you to avoid because it shows up right after a money reset and quietly ruins many of them. People set too many goals. That is another form of self-sabotage disguised as ambition. They want to pay off all debt, triple their emergency fund, max every account, save for a house, travel more, cut spending, build a side business, buy a car, get into real estate, and somehow feel less stressed while doing all of it. That is not a plan. That is panic wearing a productivity mask money. Let's business improves when priorities are few and clear. I would rather see a household accomplish 2 meaningful things than announce 9 and complete none. Maybe next year is the year the emergency reserve gets fully rebuilt and the credit card disappears. Maybe it is the year the retirement contribution rises to the full employer match and every useless recurring payment gets cut. Maybe it is the year the family stops running small monthly deficits and finally builds a real surplus. Good. Choose the sequence, respect the sequence, and stop insulting progress just because it is narrower than fantasy. The public has been taught to admire dramatic financial change, viral side income, overnight success, one amazing stock, one magical app, one debt payoff montage, that sort of thing entertains the brain and weakens the will. Real financial strength is usually much duller than that. It is a direct deposit and an automatic transfer. It is a lower phone bill. It is a canceled subscription no one will miss. It is 6 months of expenses sitting where chaos cannot easily reach them. It is a retirement contribution going up 1 percentage point. And then another, it is a yearly review that tells the truth when your feelings would rather not. I admire those things because they repeat. Repetition is where compounding begins. And compounding is not only an investment concept, it is a life concept. Small structural improvements, repeated month after month, can create astonishingly different conditions by the end of a year, and almost unrecognizable ones by the end of a decade. That is why I do not need a money reset to feel exciting. I need it to be repeatable. I need it to build the kind of life where money is no longer shouting constantly for my attention. A good financial system should reduce noise. That is another thing the public misunderstands. They think being good with money means thinking about it more. Often it means thinking about it deeply a few times, building the right, and then thinking about it less because the machinery is now doing what your better judgment already decided it should do. That is freedom. Not the freedom to ignore your finances forever. The freedom to stop renegotiating basic good behavior every single week. And once you get there, money becomes what it should have been all along. A support system, not a source of daily drama. So yes, as the year winds down, while a great many people are thinking only about slowing down, I become more alert, not anxious clear. Because these last weeks give you one of the cleanest chances you will get all year to stop drifting and start designing. If you use them well, next year does not merely arrive. It starts with structure.